The rescue of horrors as sudden floodwaters engulfed a large area. Homes were washed away, cars were submerged, and roads were rendered useless by the devastation of nature. The scene was an unimaginable disaster, but that's when rescuers like John Carter came into the picture. John Carter is a kind-hearted man, always ready to help others in need. He is part of a volunteer rescue team, working tirelessly for days in the flooded area, rescuing stranded residents, and trying to help any creatures at risk. One gloomy morning, as the floodwaters rose rapidly, John was preparing for a rescue mission. He received an urgent call from the rescue center, reporting an animal trapped in the rushing water. Without hesitation, John hurriedly got on the rescue boat, and together with another rescue team, they began their journey into the flooded area to save the animal. The fateful encounter when John and the rescue team arrived at the reported area, the scene before their eyes shocked everyone. A large dog was struggling in the strong current. The strong waves pushed the dog, making it confused and gradually weakened. The dog's eyes were wide open, frantically searching for help, but its body was too tired. No longer having the strength to fight the water, the dog gradually sank, almost losing hope. John, without hesitation, immediately jumped into the water, ignoring the waves and the danger that awaited. He tried to stay calm and move towards the dog. After a few tense minutes, John was almost close to the dog. With all his remaining strength, he pulled the animal up, trying to bring it into the boat while coaxing the dog to calm down. The dog was weak, trembling all over, but still alive. John carried it to the boat, and as soon as he got it safely inside, it began to gasp and cough, trying to breathe fresh air. The water behind the boat gradually calmed down, but John's heart continued to beat strongly. He could feel the dog's weakness, but the feeling of happiness knowing that it was still alive and strong made him feel relieved. A moment of silence, the dog was wrapped in a rescue blanket, panting. John watched closely, realizing that the dog was not a wild animal, but seemed to have had another life. Its fur was a bit disheveled, but when he wiped away the dirty water, he saw a strange scar on its left leg, a sign that not all dogs had. Although the dog no longer had the energy to move, its eyes were still full of confusion, as if searching for safety. John gently stroked the dog, comforting it as the rescue boat brought them back to shore. He wondered about the dog, about what had happened before it was left in the flood. Bringing the dog to the hospital after bringing the dog to shore, John quickly took it to the nearest veterinary clinic. It was a small but very reputable veterinary hospital in the area. Dr. Elizabeth Walker, the main veterinarian, was the one who took the dog in. When Elizabeth saw the dog, she immediately recognized the panic in its eyes. She understood that this was not just a lost dog, but an animal that had probably gone through some terrible experiences. She quickly conducted a preliminary examination and found that the dog's health was not seriously damaged, but it was still exhausted from fatigue. Its legs were slightly shaking, and its empty eyes showed that it had just gone through a big fight. Elizabeth conducted a closer examination and discovered a strange mark on the dog's leg. It was an old scar, like a deep cut, but there was a strange mark near it, like some kind of symbol or marking carved into the skin. A feeling of unease began to creep into her. Was this dog a wild animal, or did it belong to someone? And why did it have such a strange mark? Anxiety and anticipation while waiting for the autopsy results and the necessary information, John couldn't stop thinking about the dog. He wondered if the dog was an abused animal or part of a more complicated story. Was there something behind this dog that he didn't know? He looked into the eyes of the dog lying still in the examination room, seemingly trying to adjust to the change in its surroundings. Even though it couldn't speak, John sensed that there was a secret that the dog wanted to reveal, a story that had yet to be told. The strange secret when John Carter brought Samson, the dog, to Dr. Elizabeth Walker's clinic. The atmosphere in the clinic was tense. Elizabeth was an experienced veterinarian, but she had never encountered a case like this. Samson seemed weak, tired, and still unable to fully recover from the panic he had just experienced. The dog refused to eat or drink water, and his eyes still sparkled with fear. The feeling of unease came not only from Samson's health, but also from the strange signs Elizabeth had noticed. The scar on the dog's leg was a puzzling detail. Not only that, this wound could be a sign of a dark story that no one had ever known. Physical examination, Elizabeth began a more thorough examination. She gently examined the dog's body from head to toe, hoping to find more information that would help solve the mystery. As she removed the dog's damp fur, Elizabeth discovered several old wounds, scratches from scratching that appeared to have healed over time. However, there were no signs of infection or serious injury. When she came to the strange scar on the dog's left leg, Elizabeth stopped. She couldn't believe her eyes. The scar was shaped like a symbol, almost like a letter. The letter was not a normal wound, but rather a mark carved into the skin. She took careful notes and noticed that the scar looked quite new, probably made in the last few months. It was unlike any natural wound she encountered in the past. Elizabeth felt that something was wrong. Microchip and related findings. As Elizabeth continued to examine the dog, she noticed that there was a small piece of plastic in the dog's back, a microchip. She immediately used the microchip scanner, hoping to find out who owned the dog. As soon as the scan was complete, the dog's information appeared on the screen. Samson's owner was Matthew Turner. However, to Elizabeth's surprise, as she continued reading, she discovered that the dog had been missing for 3 years and that Matthew Turner had reported it stolen from his home. A strange feeling swept over Elizabeth. Why was the dog here in this condition? And why had it been abandoned in a flood when its owner had been searching for it for 3 years? New questions arose. The information about Matthew Turner only added to the confusion. Elizabeth began to feel that something was wrong. How had the dog survived 3 years without anyone caring for it? If Matthew really was its owner, why had the dog been left in such a miserable state? John stood by, contemplating all that had just been discovered. He looked at Elizabeth with suspicion in his eyes. They both sensed that Samson's story was not as simple as it seemed. There was definitely something hidden. Discussion and decision of action. As Elizabeth and John sat down to discuss the situation, they felt increasingly confused. The strange marks on the dog's body were not just signs of abuse, but they could point to a larger story, a secret that had not yet been revealed. John suspected that Matthew Turner might not be the good guy he appeared to be. But why would Matthew report the dog stolen? And was he connected to some criminal organization? Samson is not a stray, Elizabeth said firmly. He lived a different life before he was left in this flood. And the marks on his paws suggest there is a complicated story behind it. John nodded. We have to figure this out. We both feel like something is not right. So, the two decided to dig deeper into Matthew Turner and try to find out more about Samson's past. First, they decided to scan Matthew's records to see if there were any clues that he was involved in an illegal organization, such as animal trafficking or dogfighting. Shocking discovery after Elizabeth Walker and John Carter discover a strange mark on Samson's leg. They can't take their eyes off the dog lying in the clinic. John senses that something very serious is going on, but he can't quite put his finger on what it is. As Elizabeth continues to examine him, she begins to think that a microchip scan might be the next important step in uncovering his true past. One afternoon, while the clinic is fairly quiet, Elizabeth decides to do another checkup to make sure she hasn't missed anything important. She grabs a microchip scanner and gently runs it over Samson's body. The microchip and the big discovery. When Elizabeth scans the microchip again, she is a little skeptical at first, but when the screen shows the information from the chip, she can't believe her eyes. The information on the screen showed that Samson had been missing for 3 years, and that his previous owner was none other than Matthew Turner, the man who had reported the dog stolen and had been searching for it for the past 3 years. This made her dumbfounded, and a strange feeling filled the entire room. Matthew Turner? Elizabeth whispered. She had just realized that Samson's previous owner was the man who had come to the clinic not long ago to pick up the dog. But if Matthew had reported that Samson was stolen, then why was the dog in such a state, in a flood with no one to protect it? This question made Elizabeth feel that this was not just an ordinary missing person case. What happened in the past 3 years, and why had the dog been left in such a terrible condition? This increased her suspicions about Matthew Turner, making her decide that she had to get to the bottom of it. Feeling painful and worried, John stood by. Hearing this information, feeling choked up. He had met Matthew Turner before, but his suspicions grew when he learned about Samson's disappearance. He recalled his encounter with Matthew at the clinic, his cold demeanor, and the way the dog reacted in fear. These were details he couldn't ignore. So it was stolen 3 years ago. But why is it here now? John thought. He felt that there was something fishy about Matthew. His unease grew as he wondered if Matthew was involved in some criminal network. At the same time, Elizabeth decided to check Matthew Turner's file again to find out about the man to see if there were any signs that he was involved in illegal activities. She believed that it was no coincidence that Matthew had lost Samson, and that there must be a reason behind his disappearance. Looking for more clues meanwhile, Elizabeth continued to search for the information available in Matthew Turner's file. She quickly noticed that his name had appeared in a number of police reports, particularly in relation to illegal animal trafficking. However, these reports had all been closed, and there was no clear evidence of Matthew's involvement in criminal activity. But there was no denying that his name had come up in investigations into dogfighting and wildlife trafficking. Samson wasn't an abandoned dog. He could have been used for something else. Maybe dogfighting or part of an illegal animal trafficking network, Elizabeth exclaimed, her anxiety growing. We have to investigate further, John replied. Samson may not be the only dog that has fallen into the hands of someone like Matthew Turner. The two decided that they would not let this matter go unanswered. John was determined to find out more about Matthew Turner and what he might be hiding. Investigating Matthew's history with the help of his rescue team colleagues and some connections in the industry, John begins to investigate Matthew Turner's past. He not only seeks information from the police, but also approaches people in the area who may know more about Matthew's past. After a few days, John receives information from an old friend of Matthew's, who reveals that Matthew was part of a criminal organization involved in illegal dogfighting and dog trafficking. This story begins to get complicated and makes John and Elizabeth realize that they are facing a much bigger case than they thought. New discovery at the same time. John and Elizabeth receive an unexpected call from another friend, who reports that they have found some traces of Samson in areas that are considered hotbeds of wildlife trafficking. This makes the story even more serious. Samson may not have been just the victim of an ordinary theft, but part of a vast criminal network. Suspicious encounter after the unexpected discoveries about Matthew Turner and his shady past, John Carter and Dr. Elizabeth Walker begin to feel the tension. They learn that Samson is now not just a dog in need, but a living witness to a great crime. The strange marks on Samson's body, along with the discoveries about Matthew Turner, indicate that the truth behind the dog's disappearance is much deeper than they had thought. The next day, Matthew Turner arrives at the clinic to claim his dog. When he enters the room, he has a cold exterior and a rather indifferent demeanor. John and Elizabeth prepare to welcome him, but worry rises when they realize that Matthew shows no emotion at all upon seeing Samson again. Instead, he stands still, observing the dog, but does not seem happy or worried like a real owner. The first encounter as Matthew approached the dog, Samson appeared frightened. The dog backed away, bristled, and growled softly as if trying to get away from the man. It was an undeniable reaction. Samson knew exactly who had caused him pain, and his fear was obvious. Elizabeth sensed something was wrong. She stepped forward, blocking Matthew's path as he tried to get closer to Samson. Samson isn't comfortable seeing you, Elizabeth said, trying to sound calm but worried. We need more time to make sure he's stable before you take him home. Matthew looked at her coldly. He didn't say anything, just nodded slowly and backed away. His silence, however, made John uneasy. Matthew didn't seem worried or even happy to see his long-lost dog again. His attitude made John even more suspicious of Matthew's true motives. Suspicious attitude, the encounter became even more bizarre when Matthew began to converse with Elizabeth and John in a brief, even disinterested manner. When Elizabeth asked why Samson had been left in such a state, Matthew simply replied, "He got lost. I don't know how he got here." Matthew's attitude made John and Elizabeth even more incredulous. There was no emotion, no inquiry about the dog's condition, and especially no concern when talking about Samson being left behind. This was clearly unusual. If Matthew really was Samson's owner, why didn't he show any concern for his condition? Something's not right, John whispered, watching Matthew's every move. He noticed that Matthew not only seemed cold, but also had an overconfidence, as if he knew everything that was going to happen. The erratic behavior of Matthew made John and Elizabeth believe that he was hiding something. Growing doubt after the meeting ended, John and Elizabeth went back to discuss what had just happened. They decided not to hand Samson over to Matthew until they found out the truth. John insisted that there was something fishy about Matthew's actions, and Elizabeth agreed with him. "It seems Matthew knows very well that no one will suspect him," John said with a serious expression. "He didn't react when he saw Samson again, and his attitude when he faced the dog only made us more suspicious. Maybe he knows that no one will dig deeper into his past." Elizabeth nodded. "That's right. Samson reacted with fear when he saw him. It couldn't be a coincidence. Maybe Matthew had done something to the dog before. John decided to continue investigating Matthew Turner. He felt that if he didn't find out the truth quickly, Samson would fall into the hands of a dangerous criminal. They couldn't let Matthew take the dog without checking it out again. The determination to continue while John and Elizabeth continued their investigation. Matthew returned with a stoic expression and showed no signs of concern. He seemed to know that things would go his way. But John and Elizabeth were determined not to let that happen. "We have to find out the truth quickly," John insisted. "Samson is the key to the bigger story. If we don't do anything, Matthew will continue to hurt other animals." Investigating Matthew's attitude after a suspicious encounter with Matthew Turner, John Carter and Dr. Elizabeth Walker have no doubt something is very wrong with Matthew's demeanor and actions. Samson is clearly not a stray dog, but part of a much more complicated story. John and Elizabeth are determined to get to the bottom of Matthew and what he is really hiding. The next day, John begins his investigation into Matthew Turner, starting with the basics. He looks into Matthew's background, looking for any traces of his past, suspicious activities, or connections that could lead to illegal dealings. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continues to check on Samson's health, trying to make sure the dog hasn't suffered any further injuries. Discovering related information after a few days of digging through files and documents, John discovers some interesting things about Matthew Turner's past. He found an old police file related to animal trafficking, especially dogs. This information showed that Matthew had a history of being involved in illegal dogfighting and wildlife trafficking. This was something John felt he couldn't ignore. One of the most important pieces of information John found was that Matthew had been involved in a major investigation 3 years earlier when Samson went missing. The police had been investigating a number of criminal activities related to the dog trade, and Matthew Turner was considered one of the main suspects. However, there was not enough evidence to charge him, and the case was closed, allowing Matthew to continue living freely without being prosecuted. So Matthew was involved in a major criminal organization, but he wasn't convicted, John thought, feeling frustrated. "We have to find more evidence to expose it all." Relationship with an old friend to learn more about Matthew Turner, John decided to contact an old friend of his, David Marshall, an investigator who had worked on the wildlife trafficking squad. David was a man with extensive connections in the criminal world and also had important information about cases that had been solved or had not been solved. David agreed to share some information and revealed that, at the time Matthew was suspected of being involved in the animal trafficking cases, he had been in contact with a group of people who organized illegal dogfighting. These subjects were also linked to other gangs, with the participation of many influential individuals in the criminal world. David also emphasized that, although Matthew had not been convicted, he continued to be involved in other criminal activities, possibly those related to animal abuse. Matthew may not have been the leader, but he was definitely part of a larger network, David said. "Be careful, John. He's very clever and knows how to cover his tracks." This information makes John and Elizabeth even more determined. They know that they need to gather more evidence if they want to expose what Matthew is doing and protect Samson from danger. Samson's new behavior when she returns to the clinic, Elizabeth notices that Samson is acting differently. Although he is no longer as fearful as before, he is still very alert. Whenever there is a loud noise or a stranger approaches, the dog shivers and appears anxious. Elizabeth realizes that Samson is not an ordinary dog, but an animal that has been through a lot of pain and suffering. He must have been abused in the past, Elizabeth tells John as they discuss Samson's condition. "He will need time to recover, but we must do everything we can to protect him." In addition, another sign that Elizabeth noticed was the strange scar on Samson's leg. It was not just an ordinary wound, but also had lines that made her suspect that this could be a sign of a special punishment, a cruel treatment that not everyone knew about. Elizabeth decided to study this scar more closely and seek more information from experts in the field of animal diagnosis. Growing determination with the information they had just gathered, John and Elizabeth were determined to act quickly. John continued to monitor Matthew's movements, while Elizabeth continued to collect evidence of the abuses against Samson. They knew that time was running out, and if they did not act promptly, Matthew might continue to deceive everyone and bring Samson back into the arms of a criminal network. "We cannot let it end like this," John said firmly. "Samson deserves a good life, and we will do everything to ensure that." Evidence and abuse, everything seems to be unraveling. John Carter and Dr. Elizabeth Walker have some important information, but they know that only hard evidence can bring Matthew Turner to justice. John feels a strong urge that they are about to enter a fierce struggle to protect Samson and unravel the truth behind the dog's mysterious past. Elizabeth has begun to notice strange signs in Samson's behavior as he gradually recovers physically. However, she also notices that the signs of abuse are not only physical, but also mental. Samson begins to react strongly whenever someone tries to approach or touch his body, especially around the strange scar on his left leg. The dog is not only a victim of neglect, but also a creature that has been abused mentally and physically. New abuse discovery one afternoon. As Elizabeth was re-examining the injuries on Samson's body, she discovered another deep and suspicious wound on the dog's back. This wound was unlike the usual cuts she had seen. Both the scar and the wound showed signs of intentional infliction, and they could have been the result of brutal torture. A terrible feeling crept into her heart. Samson was not only a victim of neglect, but also a victim of a life filled with pain and cruelty. Elizabeth decided to collect more evidence of these injuries. She took photos and recorded all the injuries on Samson's body as evidence. However, she knew that these injuries could not be the only evidence against Matthew Turner. She needed further expert testimony to determine whether these injuries were the result of abuse. Searching for more evidence, John continued to follow Matthew and search for more information about his illegal activities. Although Matthew's involvement in animal trafficking and dogfighting had been confirmed, they needed more evidence to solidify their case. One day, while going through old files, John stumbled upon some leaked videos from a previous investigation that Matthew Turner had been involved in. The videos showed brutal dogfighting, with animals being forced to engage in deadly fights. The dogs were beaten, forced to fight until they were exhausted. Matthew was seen in the videos with a group of other people, clearly the organizers and participants of these activities. This footage was not only a vital piece of evidence, but also proof that Matthew was deeply involved in a network of animal trafficking and cruelty. John and Elizabeth both knew that they had to act quickly. These photos and videos were a major discovery and could be the key to solving the case. However, they also knew that confronting Matthew directly could be a dangerous move. He would likely react violently, and they needed to be prepared for the unexpected. Tensions rising one evening as John and Elizabeth discussed their next steps, Matthew appeared at the clinic again, this time looking even more determined. He seemed to know that things were not going so well, and now he was looking for a way to regain control of Samson. "Samson seems to be doing better," Matthew said, his voice as cold as ever. "I want to take him home. Thank you for taking care of him." Elizabeth remained calm, but her nerves were rising. She looked at Samson, who was huddled in a corner of the room, occasionally glancing at Matthew with frightened eyes. "We need more time to monitor his condition," Elizabeth replied. "Samson still needs long-term care before we can take him home." Matthew said nothing more, but he just looked at Elizabeth and John patiently, as if he knew that eventually things would go back to normal. John and Elizabeth's determination from that moment on, things seemed to take a turn for the worse. John and Elizabeth knew that they had enough evidence to confront Matthew, but the fight would not be easy. They had to find a way to take the evidence to the next level, strong enough to bring down all of his schemes. They decided to continue gathering evidence from legal experts and approaching the authorities. Confronting Matthew could not be based on speculation or emotion. They needed a solid legal case to stop him. John told Elizabeth, "We will not stop until Matthew pays. Samson has had enough. This is not just a case, but a fight for justice." Escape plan. All the evidence that John Carter and Dr. Elizabeth Walker have gathered has gradually shed light on the relationship between Matthew Turner and a criminal network of animal traffickers. However, even though things are starting to become clearer, they know that they cannot stop here. Matthew seems to be more determined and dangerous. Not only does he want to get Samson back, but he may also go to any lengths to hide his crimes. When John notices that Matthew has started to appear near the veterinary hospital more frequently, he feels a sense of anxiety. He knows that if he doesn't act quickly, Matthew may find a way to get close to Samson and take him away from the safe haven they have built for him. So John and Elizabeth decide to do something bold to protect Samson and stop Matthew. A secret action. They both know what must be done to protect Samson from the potential danger posed by Matthew. They contacted a secret animal rescue network that they knew could help get Samson out of harm's way. However, this was not an easy task, as Matthew could easily monitor the veterinary hospital and discover their plan. So they decided to carry out the plan under the cover of darkness, a secret move at night, just before Matthew could find out. Elizabeth and John planned carefully. They prepared for a long night, when everything would be done in secret. They would take Samson to a secure facility, where he would be cared for and protected forever, away from anyone who would want to harm him. Putting the plan in action, the day of the escape arrived, and everything was planned in detail. Elizabeth was ready to put Samson in a rescue vehicle, hiding him under sheets and other items so that no one would notice his presence. John had created a protective barrier, ensuring that no one could follow them during their journey. As night fell, the two began to put their plan into action. Elizabeth entered the veterinary hospital with Samson in her arms, and John followed quietly behind, always alert for any signs that might alert Matthew or anyone else who might be watching. Everything happened in pitch-black silence, but they were both nervous. As they approached the tow truck that had been parked in a safe spot, a sudden noise came from behind them. John turned around, seeing a figure emerge from the dim light of the streetlights. It was Matthew. Tensions rising, Matthew looked at them with cold eyes, as if he knew everything. "You think I don't know?" he asked, his tone calm but menacing. John immediately sensed the tension in the air. Matthew was not one to be fooled, and now he was beginning to suspect that Samson was being taken away. "What are you doing, Matthew?" John asked, trying to keep his composure. Matthew stepped closer, his eyes cold and sharp. "I know what you're going to do. I just don't understand why you're hiding things. Samson is mine, and I'm going to get him back." They both knew that if Matthew got close to Samson, things would end in tragedy. John and Elizabeth couldn't wait any longer, so they decided to confront him. John clenched his fists and prepared for a confrontation. The confrontation became tense, and Matthew showed no fear. He knew he was in control, but John and Elizabeth were determined not to give up. John glanced at Elizabeth, and she nodded, signaling him to start the confrontation. As Matthew moved closer, John sprang into action. He quickly pulled Samson out of Elizabeth's arms and pushed the dog into the rescue vehicle. In that moment, everything stopped. Matthew moved towards them, but John stood in front of him, determined to protect Samson no matter what. "Don't think I'm going to let you get away with this, dog," John barked, his eyes determined. Matthew didn't respond, but his steps were menacing. The situation became more dangerous than ever, and Elizabeth could feel the tension rising. But in that moment, another car intervened unexpectedly. The rescue vehicle had arrived, and a group of people from the Animal Rescue Network appeared to support John and Elizabeth. In the end, Matthew couldn't stop their plan. The rescue team quickly loaded Samson into the car and drove away, leaving the scene in chaos. The crucial witness Samson's escape is a success, but the dangers are not over. Although John Carter and Dr. Elizabeth Walker have protected the dog from Matthew Turner, they know that their plan is flawed if they cannot produce enough evidence to indict Matthew and the criminal activities he is involved in. Their protection of Samson can only survive if they can bring Matthew to justice and stop him once and for all. While Samson is cared for and safe at the rescue facility, John and Elizabeth continue their investigation and search for any witnesses who can help build the case against Matthew. They know that it will not be easy to find strong evidence against someone like Matthew, who has survived many cases without being convicted. However, they realize that a crucial witness could be the key to turning the tide. An important witness, the witness John and Elizabeth are looking for, is none other than Robert Pierce, an old friend of Matthew Turner who left him after discovering Matthew's involvement in crimes. Robert is an important witness as he knows a lot about illegal animal trafficking activities, especially about Matthew running a dogfighting ring. However, getting close to Robert is not easy. John decides to contact Robert through some acquaintances in the Animal Rescue Network. Elizabeth has also prepared a detailed statement to convince Robert to cooperate, as they need an insider who can provide detailed information about Matthew's activities. However, Robert has been living in fear and obsession since leaving Matthew and does not want to be involved in any investigation. The encounter with Robert late one afternoon, John and Elizabeth meet Robert Pierce at a deserted coffee shop where he has agreed to meet them. Robert seemed nervous, glancing around to check if anyone was watching him. When they sat down, Robert began to speak in a hoarse voice, as if he had not spoken for too long. "I don't want to be involved in anything related to Matthew anymore," Robert said, his voice shaking. I left him because I couldn't stand what he did anymore. The animals, the dogfights. I can't go back, I'm scared. John and Elizabeth both understood the fear in Robert's voice, but they also knew that he was the vital witness they were looking for. John gently persuaded Robert. We don't want to put you in danger, John said, his eyes determined. We just want to bring Matthew to justice. Samson is just one of the many dogs he has harmed. You can help us help many other creatures. After a moment of silence, Robert took a deep breath and let it out as if he had made up his mind. Okay, he said, his voice more determined. I will tell you what I know, but only if you promise to protect me. Important testimony. Robert began to recount the horrific details of Matthew and the criminal activities he had been involved in. Matthew was not only behind the dogfighting, but was also involved in a wildlife trafficking network where animals were stolen and sold on the black market. Matthew had even begun to work with strangers from other countries, creating a large-scale animal trafficking system. Abused dogs like Samson were not isolated cases, but part of Matthew's grand plan. Robert revealed that Matthew had started this relationship at a young age and had built a closed criminal enterprise. He had conned a lot of people, Robert said. He used his strength and ruthlessness to take animals from good owners and then sell them to other gangs for their own evil purposes. Robert's testimony was a major revelation. He not only described Matthew's involvement in criminal activities, but also provided important details about how the organization operated. Robert even recalled Matthew revealing that he was about to embark on a larger operation to purchase dogs from far-flung locations, including recruiting strangers from other countries to bring them in. Strengthening the evidence, Robert provided John and Elizabeth with some of the confidential documents he had kept from the past, including records of transactions and some of the key names in Matthew's network. He also pointed out several locations that Matthew and his associates used to stash the stolen dogs before handing them over to other criminal organizations. With Robert's testimony and the documents he provided, John and Elizabeth were now able to build a stronger case than ever before. They knew that Matthew was not just a simple criminal, but part of a dark network, and they had to act quickly to stop it before it was too late. Presenting the evidence after gathering key statements from Robert Pierce, along with strong documentary and video evidence, John Carter and Dr. Elizabeth Walker felt they were ready to bring Matthew Turner to justice. However, they knew that they could not rely on the testimony of a single witness, no matter how important, to convict Matthew. They needed a solid strategy, not only to get Matthew convicted, but also to dismantle the entire criminal network he had created. Elizabeth and John continued to work with the authorities, including the police and animal welfare agencies, to ensure they had the evidence and legal support they needed. Under the supervision of legal experts, they began to prepare their case and plan how to bring charges against Matthew and his group. Organizing the investigation, John met with the investigation team, which included people with experience in handling cases involving animal trafficking and dogfighting. With the help of professional investigators, they began to compile all the evidence they had gathered, videos of Matthew's crimes, Robert's testimony, and detailed documents about the animal trafficking network Matthew was involved in. Elizabeth also worked closely with wildlife experts who were able to confirm that Matthew's actions were cruel and unacceptable under the law. They prepared expert reports proving that Matthew's actions were not only illegal, but also caused severe harm to animals, especially Samson. Taking evidence to legal authorities, once all the documents and evidence had been gathered, John and Elizabeth decided to take the case to the competent legal authorities. Matthew Turner would face a trial with full evidence against him. Both understood that this was an important turning point that could change the outcome of the case. John and Elizabeth meet with prosecutor Rachel Walker, who will be representing the case in court. Rachel is an experienced prosecutor, but this case could be a challenge for her. Rachel has long heard about Matthew's illegal activities, but now with clear evidence in hand, she will have to do everything to bring him to justice. We have enough evidence to put Matthew behind bars, Rachel says as she looks over the documents John and Elizabeth have provided. But I warn you, he is not an easy man to defeat. He will fight back. John and Elizabeth both understand that. They know that, while Matthew may try to maneuver, this time, they will not let him get away. With the support of Rachel and the authorities, they have enough power to bring Matthew to justice. Pressure from Matthew after learning that the evidence has been turned over to the legal authorities, Matthew Turner begins to act. He knew his day was coming and would not let himself be caught without a fight. He tried to intimidate John and Elizabeth, even approaching insiders to shake their confidence. Matthew did not hesitate to use his criminal connections to pressure the investigation team. Some of the veterinary hospital staff also received veiled threats from Matthew, asking them to keep quiet and not cooperate with law enforcement. However, John and Elizabeth were not swayed. They knew that they could only keep their faith and proceed as planned. Matthew's tactics: when Matthew failed to shake the investigation team, he turned to another method: misleading the public. He began creating media campaigns to smear John and Elizabeth, labeling them as wrongdoers. He also had people spread false information about Samson, claiming that the dog had not been abused and was a wild animal. However, Matthew's tricks could not hide the truth. Rachel Walker and her legal team worked tirelessly to maintain the integrity and honesty of the case. Matthew could not fool the public easily. Animal rights organizations and the community stood up to support John and Elizabeth, increasing the pressure on Matthew. The final confrontation: finally, the day came when Matthew Turner faced justice. John and Elizabeth felt nervous but also proud. The evidence they had collected was too strong for Matthew to avoid responsibility. The trial would be their last chance to prove that Matthew was responsible for the brutal and illegal acts he had committed. Justice is served. After a long and arduous battle, Matthew Turner's trial has finally begun. John Carter and Dr. Elizabeth Walker have done everything they can to gather evidence and prepare for this legal battle. From Robert Pierce's crucial testimony to videos and documents related to Matthew's criminal activities, they have prepared an unassailable case. Matthew Turner is not an easy criminal to defeat. He has gotten away with many cases in the past, but this time things will be different. John and Elizabeth have built a solid strategy together, and they know that now everything will be decided in the courtroom. The day of the trial begins. The atmosphere in the courtroom is stifling and tense. Matthew walks into the courtroom with a confident look, as if he is still in control of the situation. He does not appear nervous, but the truth is, this time he has no way out. The trial begins. As the trial began, Rachel Walker, the prosecutor for the case, stood up and began to present the case against Matthew Turner. She was strong and confident, using all the evidence that John and Elizabeth had gathered to prove that Matthew was not only an animal trafficker, but also a cruel person who abused and abandoned many innocent animals. You have heard the testimony of Robert Pierce, a key witness who witnessed Matthew Turner's crimes. You have also seen videos and documents that prove that Matthew organized brutal dogfights and illegally trafficked animals, Rachel said, her eyes never leaving Matthew. His actions were not only illegal, but they also caused irreparable harm to innocent creatures. All eyes were on Matthew, and he could not hide his anxiety. But he tried to maintain a confident appearance, seemingly not worried at all about the evidence against him. A call for justice: John stood up to give his testimony. He began by telling the story of Samson's rescue, how he had suffered and fought to survive during Matthew's abuse. He also recounted the situation Samson had faced when he was rescued and showed that, although he could not speak, the dog still carried a great deal of pain. Samson was not the only dog that Matthew had taken away, John said, his voice filled with emotion. There were thousands of other animals. And we are here to testify for the animals that cannot speak. Justice must be served. Matthew Turner cannot continue to live in the shadows and continue to harm them. Elizabeth stood next to John, adding more information about Samson's health and the injuries he had suffered in the past. She was not only a veterinarian, but also someone who had witnessed firsthand the cruelty Matthew had inflicted. Matthew made Samson's life a nightmare, and he did it to countless other animals. But today, we stand here for justice, for the protection of all the creatures he destroyed, Elizabeth said. The court's decision: after all the evidence had been presented and testimony had been heard, the court began to consider the important elements of the case. Matthew Turner could not refute the clear and powerful evidence that the investigation team had gathered. Testimonies, videos, documents, and especially the testimony of Robert Pierce helped to uncover the secret that Matthew had tried to hide for years. Finally, the court rendered a verdict. Matthew Turner was convicted of crimes related to illegal animal trafficking, organizing dogfighting, animal abuse, and many other crimes. He will serve a long prison sentence, and all assets related to his criminal activities will be confiscated. Justice is served. As the verdict was read, a wave of relief swept through the courtroom. Samson, along with all the animals Matthew had harmed, had finally received justice. Matthew Turner, with all the crimes he had committed, could no longer escape punishment. John and Elizabeth looked at each other, a great sense of accomplishment washing over them. They had finally achieved what they had always dreamed of, justice for Samson and for all the innocent animals Matthew had taken from them.